The so-called CHOP protest area on Seattle's Capitol Hill, where city crews have begun finally removing barricades. This is something that was planned last week, was postponed over the weekend. Protesters, though, as you might be able to make out here, they're not standing down. They put up some of their own barricades. And right now, the Seattle Parks and Rec Department has announced that Cal Anderson Park nearby is temporarily closing so crews can assess damage and remove waste.
Crews came in around 9:30 this morning with bulldozers clearing out the concrete barriers at 10th and Pine that have been set up there since the occupied protests began. Police officers, they were working in partnership with SDOT crews, making things went smoothly. Assistant Chief Adrian Diaz says that there are also officers going up to people inside of tents in Cal Anderson Park and being offered resources to help them out of crisis. And as far as a plan, though, to move back into the East Precinct, there is still no word on that.
2 young teens involved in this latest shooting, just 16 and 14 years old. The call came in this morning about 3 a.m. And as you look down the road, this is where police got multiple calls about shots being fired into a Jeep. It ended about a block from where I'm standing, just beyond the barricade there. And you can see it is right in the CHOP.
2 men are dead. 2 men are dead. And a child, a 14-year-old, is hospitalized, and we don't know what is going to happen to that kid.
That 14-year-old is in critical condition and fighting for his life, and his 16-year-old friend is dead, the latest of 6 shooting victims since CHOP's inception. Police admit they're struggling too. They say CHOP protesters aren't cooperating and they need witnesses. The SUV the teens were riding in is riddled with bullet holes.
The typical things we search for in a case like this or in a shooting like this weren't there, and it is abundantly clear to our detectives people had been in and out of the car after the shooting.
Some Seattle City Council members say the CHOP is not to blame.
And we need to do something about it. It is absolutely irresponsible for this to continue.
Seattle's police chief standing in front of a vacant East Precinct, essentially sending a message to her boss, the mayor.
Oh, you have to talk with her people. I'm sure she's willing to talk to anybody who wants to talk to her.
In a statement, a mayor spokesperson says the area has increasingly attracted more individuals bent on division and violence, and there has been unacceptable behavior by individuals. Council members spoke of the whys. The chief spoke about the need to end CHOP, and the mayor talked about unwanted violence, but nobody talked about CHOP's immediate future and what will happen to the East Precinct.
I just think that there's going to have to be action taken at some point if there isn't a breakthrough.
And that action, to Jesus Villahermosa, involves using force to return the East Precinct to Seattle police.
And if force has to be used, then force has to be used as long as it's necessary and reasonable.
He says the recent violence and the continuing presence of CHOP says to him that negotiations between protesters and the city aren't accomplishing much.
SPD says 911 call response times are going up because of the protests here, adding officers are only able to respond to priority calls when demonstrators are outside the building.
The results of the CHOP, is evidence of what can occur if police aren't allowed to do our jobs.
The Downtown Seattle Association says they know resources are stretched thin because of the duration of the protests here in our region, but that 88,000 people living in downtown need to know if they can depend on basic city services.